It is October 19th, 2005. This is the interview of Lanis Copeland for the Veterans History Project. He was born on August 7th, 1919. And the names of the people attending the interview is myself, the camera operator Caleb Copeland, Katie Moon, and Jason Fieker. And we're working with Missouri State University GEP 397 course. Lanis served in the Army in World War II. He was a T4, correct?
Technician 4.
Technician 4. And served in the Battle of Normandy. And
well, I went in on D1, D+1 in Normandy.
Okay.
And stayed through all of the battle area, all the way through up to the Battle of the Bulge.
All right. To start out, were you drafted or enlisted?
I enlisted.
And what was your feelings at the time when you enlisted? Why did you want to enlist?
Well, first thing I wanted to, I felt responsibility to serve my country, number one, and number two, I wanted to at least get into something. The reason I volunteered was to get in and get something, so I'd get something more or less what I wanted. So which didn't work out too well, but that's what I was trying to do.
How old were you when you enlisted?
I was 22.
Were you married?
Yes.
How long had you been married for?
I'd been married a little over a year.
So what did your wife think of you enlisting?
I'm sorry?
What did your wife think when you enlisted?
Well, she thought it was all right, so we agreed. Yeah. So she knew it was going to be drafted anyway, so because I was in 1A, you know, that meant you was going to be drafted. And we went ahead and I just went ahead and volunteered.
So after you enlisted, what was your training?
Was it what?
What was your training like?
Training?
Yeah.
Well, I took my basic training in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and there's 8 weeks of that. Then I went from there to a specialist school in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, for 3 months, and trained in communications. And after that, they sent me to Fort Sam Houston, Texas, to join the 2nd Division there. So, you know, we just trained as a division for the invasion in Europe, you know. Different types of training. We had maneuvers in Louisiana. Then we come back to Fort Sam Houston and had airborne training. After that, we went to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, and we took winter training, skiing, and learned to ski and, well, surviving cold. That's what we was trying to do. You know. So I stayed there till I went overseas. So from there I went to Ireland and trained for about 5 months. And of course we was just taking steps to getting into the invasion. So that's what we was there for.
What was the toughest part of your training?
Well, the toughest part I run into was the winter training in northern Michigan. It got 45 below zero and we were sleeping outside up there, so it's pretty tough. But we made it. So.
Do you remember your first days in the service, or
First days in the service?
Yeah.
Well, I remember that was all boot camp, you know, so yeah, I remember that pretty well. Back then we had to serve, they don't have KP anymore. Back then we had to, because I remember working on in KP there, basic training and guard duty and all that sort of stuff. And then we take rifle training and marching, you know, learning all of the do's and don'ts of the Army is what it amounted to.
So do you remember arriving on your first, I guess, assignment?
You mean in Europe?
Yeah.
Well, we first went to Northern Ireland, and we landed at Belfast, and then we went to a little town called Armagh. British people owned a big castle there, Gosford Castle, so that's where our headquarters was, you know. And we trained there till April, I guess, of '44. And it was a lot of rain, a lot of fog, a lot of that, but it was pretty nice.
Do you remember your first experience with combat?
Yep. Yeah, my first experience was, we didn't get on the beach till D+1. The 1st and the 29th Division was the initial assault divisions, and our division was the 2nd Division. They was a backup for them, and we went over, you know, on D+1, and of course, yeah, I remember the artillery shells and machine guns firing at us, so yeah, it's still pretty hot around there. So we went from there, I think it took about 2 weeks to get over to St. Lo. Then we had a little stall there for about a week because we run into a lot of pretty rough competition, you know, and so we were there for, I guess, a week, something like that.
So did you move around a lot from station to station?
No.
Or were you on one location for most of your time?
Back then, why, you had they kept a front line established all the time, and you just moved and fought and take over more ground as you go, you know, and it just continuous moving up, you know. So we fought through the Normandy. It's called hedgerow country. These hedgerows that would, I guess they call them farms, you know, what we'd call about an acre of ground. There's a farm over there, you know. And I remember them German had an 88 artillery, we called them the 88s, and they had them all zeroed in at each corner at that hedgerow country, so we kind of avoided the corners and went up the ways, you know. It was a battle there for several days trying to get through hedgerow country. I'm sure any of the soldiers that was there, they'd remember the hedgerows. I believe it was a staff sergeant in one of the companies that developed a blade to go on the tanks. The tanks would go up, try to go over them hedgerows, and they'd open up for fire, you know. So they didn't want that bottom to be a showing because the machine gun could penetrate that from the bottom, you know. So he made a blade to put on there like a bulldozer, and they pushed them hedgerows down so he didn't have to. Of course, I wasn't in a tank, but there was tanks there with us. You know.
Do you remember any of the men that you fought with specifically?
Oh yeah, my battalion commander is Colonel Carpenter, and then my battery commander is Captain Schultz, and first sergeant was Sergeant Davidson, I believe. Yeah, I remember most of them guys, and some of one of the buddies was a guy named Barker, and they just several of them that I could still remember. So after I got wounded over during the Battle of the Bulge, I left my company. I went back to the hospital in England, you know. So I didn't go with them all the way through. After I think the 23rd of December, I left them. You know, that was during the Battle of the Bulge. But the Battle of the Bulge started on the 16th of December, and I left the 23rd. I think it was. I was only about 7 days during the battle.
Can you tell us how you got injured?
Well, I was, during the Battle of the Bulge, we was trying to keep communications open, and I was experienced in wire communications, so I'd climb a telephone pole, try to check that the line had got broke. I couldn't get communication, so me and another guys trying to run down the break. While I was on that pole, they opened up fire and with 88s, and of course it scared me, and I started down the pole and fell about 20 feet, and that's where I got my first injury, you know, during that. But I didn't go leave then. I waited the next day and got blowed off a Jeep, so they told me I better get out, so they sent me back to England hospital. Got me in traction from my back. You know. I got a few shrapnel wounds, but I didn't take the Purple Heart because I didn't think I earned it, so I didn't take that.
What was your hospital stay like?
Oh, it's a field hospital, you know. It's pretty good. It's there close to Birmingham, England. It was a pretty nice place, you know. So they had good food and everything. So it was a lot better than that front line.
What was your food like on the front line?
My what?
The food?
Well, you ever heard of K rations? It's
No.
a K ration. What it was, a little box about 2 inches thick by 6 inches long and 4 inches wide, and there was a meal in that. And it was good. It was really good. It had a lot of, you wouldn't think that would be much to eat, but it really, I don't know.
And you got one of those?
We got
per day?
3 of them a day. You got a breakfast, noon, and evening. We carry them in our pack, you know. If you try to get 3 or 4 days at a time, you know, where you wouldn't run out. So.
What was your specialty during combat? What were you in control of?
I worked with the Forward Observer in artillery. I was a non-commissioned officer, and I worked with a commissioned officer on the Forward Observers, and I helped him, you know, and tried to keep communications. We had a radio and tried to keep wire communications, which it wasn't possible all the time. So we always had a backpack radio, and most of the time it worked, but you'd only get about 5 or 6 miles, you know, distance. So we had to get targets. What we done is spot targets and call our fire direction center and call for the artillery fire for that target, you know. And it helped a lot because we stayed with the infantry. Of course, I wasn't in the infantry, I was in the artillery. And we'd stay with them. We had two teams. I'd stay up 3 or 4 days, and then I'd come back to the fire direction center, and the other would go up. We just alternate, you know, like that. So you got a little break. And I got to see General Patton one time. he there at the Gosford Castle in Ireland. Why we tore down a rock fence so we could get our equipment trucks and stuff through there, and it's probably 8 foot high, that rock fence was. So the British government found out about it, and so they sent General Patton and his aide over there to see we got it built back. So that's how come me to meet him. He come down one weekend, and I was on charge of quarters at the CQ. My CO was gone, so they come up, and of course I knew him. He said, "Them 6-guns, have you ever heard about General Patton?" Yeah. He wore 6-guns, them shiny 6-guns. He had them on that day. When they come up, I saluted them, and of course I didn't talk to him. I talked to his aide. He was, I think, a lieutenant colonel. And he told me why they was there. I said, "Well, you better write my CO a note and leave it with him." So he did. So Monday we started building fence. That was in North Ireland, Gosford Castle there. So we got there in October, and we stayed till April the next year there. And it was a great big old castle.
How did you stay in touch with the family back home?
V-mail. You know what V-mail is? Well, we'd write this on a big sheet, and then they'd photograph it little, and that's the way it come back. Call it V-mail then. And that's the only way you had to communicate, and we couldn't call, or we couldn't, that. Back in World War II, unless you was, a higher ranking officer or something, it's hard to get the call back home, because it wasn't allowed. In the first place, everything was so secret, we wouldn't be allowed to call unless they could censor it, They censored all of our mail, So. You didn't do much communicating back in them days. It was
How did you guys entertain yourselves during your downtime?
with a deck of cards and knock poker, stuff like that, shooting craps, tell stories and lies. They wasn't. When you had a break, some of them would go to town, and I never did. I'd go to Belfast and maybe see a show or something, but I was married, so I didn't get out and try to, like the rest of the young single guys did. We didn't have much time to do none of that much, Most of the time around camp, we'd play poker, play some kind of cards, and tell stories, and all that stuff.
What was the weather like where you were stationed?
The weather?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in Ireland, it was, that winter, didn't get real cold, but it rained a lot and was foggy a lot, and but when we got over into France, it's kind of like it is here, pretty much the same kind of weather we have. Of course, up in the forest where we were, it got pretty cold, I think, 10 or 15 below zero. During the Battle of the Bulge, well, it got colder than that. I don't remember how cold it got, but it was pretty cold. And we didn't have, the only thing I had with me, and most of them did, is a blanket. That's all you carry, You couldn't carry much stuff. And you got cold with it, but it wasn't very, warm. You dug a foxhole. Get down in that while you stay warm. With that blanket, that's about the only way you could.
What was your favorite place that you got to see, as far as the different places you went? What was your favorite?
That I got to see.
Yeah, like which country
I took a one-day pass to Paris when I got to see with the Apple Tower and all of that stuff, you know, so, yeah, that's pretty nice. Outside of that, I really did, and I got to go to London once, and I spent a night there. Of course, the Red Cross had where we, beds we get, I think they only charge us a quarter for a bed, you know, something like that. And they had meals, and they had feed us. It's pretty nice. USO put on shows, you know. I remember we got a break one time and Dinah, you ever heard of Dinah Shore? She was a movie star back, you know, I guess in the late 60s and 70s here, you know, she had a television show. But anyway, she was over one day and I was on the front row and she come back and she kissed me. So, that was quite a thrill, you know, to have
Did you ever tell your wife that story?
I'm sorry.
Did you ever tell your wife
Oh,
that
yeah,
story?
I told her. She got a big thing at it. You know, she thought that's my wife right yonder. We was born down in Arkansas, so we was kind of country people.
Do you remember what you were thinking when you found out you could go home, or what was it like going home?
Yeah, I remember that pretty well. We was waiting on the war to end in Japan, and I think it was around August 25th, somewhere around the latter part of August, they ended over there. So I was then at Soissons, France. That was just east of Paris. After I got out of the hospital, I was just in limited service, you know. So the next day after the war was over, they loaded us on a train. They called them 40 and 8. It either hauled 40 men or 8 horses, you know. That's where they got the name 40 and 8, you know. So we got on the train over Reims, France, and it took us four days and nights to go from Reims, France to Marseille, France. It must be 200 or 300 miles, all it was, you know. Then we got down there, we thought we was going to catch a boat home at Marseille. And we got down there, we stayed in a tent for 2.5 months, waiting on the boat. Just waiting, you know, so. Let's see, it was a month and a half, I guess. But anyway, we stayed in tents, waiting on the boat. And back in them days, they had so many soldiers overseas that it's just terrible to get them back. It just took a long time. So I got back Camp Shanks, New York, I guess, October the 14th, and then I got discharged the 21st. So we come back in. That's Staten Island, you know, where the Statue of Liberty is. Of course, that's the last thing he's seen when we left, and the first thing we're seeing when we come back in. So I think Bledsoe Island, and is that what it is? Yeah, Bledsoe Island. There's quite a sight to get to see.
So how long did you actually serve?
In the Army?
Mm-hmm.
3 years, about a little over 3 years, 9 months, something like that. I stayed a little over 2 years overseas, and the rest of it's here in the United States. I think it's 2 years and about a week overseas.
What was your job when you got back to the States?
When I got back,
Mm-hmm.
well, I didn't have a job. I had to find one. We got back, why, of course I had a job. I was working before I left, and I come back in the glass business, you know, glass work. So that's what I went back into, but I had to find a job. I didn't have one, you know. My wife was working at the post office there in the little town where we live, so we stayed there a while and finally went to, I worked out in North Carolina, so we went out there and worked a while, and didn't work out, so we come to Springfield, and that's where we've been ever since. it was couldn't get an automobile. Back after World War II, they didn't manufacture a civilian automobile for 3 years. And the only thing you can find is an old used car, you know, so and there wasn't very many of them. So it took me about 2 months to find a car. There wasn't none, you just couldn't find them. It was, I remember we come out and they gave you mustard and out pay, they call it. We got $300, $100 a month for 3 months. That's what our pay was. So you didn't have much money to operate on them. But it was, I was glad to get home. But we had a lot of experience with other outfits. We fought beside the 99th Division, the 29th, and I think the 1st Division was with us some. So it was quite a battle. The worst battle, of course, the worst part of it was the Battle of the Bulge. That was, didn't last too long, but that was pretty tough.
Can you explain that a little more?
Battle of the Bulge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what happened, we were spearheading a drive into Germany, and on about the 16th of December, why the Germans had, unbeknown to us, you know, they had formed a counterattack on us, and they came through the weakest part of our line and they cut us off, you know. That was starting of the Battle of the Bulge, and then we had to, there was much, our division I know was all cut off for 3 days, and others were too, and we had to fight the circle, you know, the whole front. So, and the snow was on the ground, it's cold, and the tanks, German tanks, they had tanks that was superior to ours, you know, they were tough. And so we had about a week's hard fighting there, but we went out. It was the weather was hard, the worst part of it, you know, trying to fight in that cold weather. And my company, you know, of course we had them 155 howitzers, and the shell weighed 95 pounds. And each gun, we had 4 guns in our battery, and each one of them was firing in a different direction because of we're surrounded, you know. So, and, the others in the same battalion is doing the same thing, except theirs was 105. It was a little smaller, but we won it. I think I wasn't there when it all was over because I already left, you know, 23rd. But I think it was along about the 1st of January where they pretty well had that under control. It was,
So how did you carry your ammunition if it weighed so much?
well, we carried ours for rifles on ours in the bandolier, you know, around the shoulder. And of course the howitzers, they had a truck that carried the shells for them, backing them up, you know. And of course, the only thing I used was a small weapon like a carbine, because the infantry used the bigger rifles, and we didn't have to do much firing with an artillery because we was supporting the infantry, you know, so they done most of the firing. Of course, I had to carry the gun and be ready. Yeah, I'll never forget the climbing down the side of a boat on that rope ladder and hitting that LCI, and then they get to the beach, you know, they drop that deal down, you go out off on the beach, you know. So that's quite an experience, getting into the beach.
And that was when you first arrived?
I'm sorry?
That was when you first arrived?
That's
Getting
when I
off the
first
boat?
arrived in Normandy, yeah. It was, of course, the 1st and the 29th Division had already established a beach there when we got off, because they lost a lot of people. The 1st and 29th did, but we had a little easier than they did, because they took the beating, you know. But of course we went in D+1, some of us D+2, but it's still pretty hot there. But the paratroopers, you know, they went in before we did, and parachuted in behind their lines, you know. And if it hadn't been for them, I don't know, it'd have been a lot rougher. Then we had battleships there. I don't remember the names of the battleships, but they was firing, because we couldn't get our howitzers on the beach, so the battleships was doing the firing for us, you know, until we got our artillery up there and got established. And of course, them battle wagons, they had a lot of firepower, and they really helped out, and the paratroopers. And, you know, the combat engineers, they done a heck of a job helping. And of course, my job, as I say, is working as a forward observer, you know, and it's, our job was to spot targets and call for fire on that, you know, and that's what we did.
So it sounds like there was a lot of teamwork in between the different areas.
The way our the artillery was set up, we had what they call a fire direction center, and you get all of the information back to them, and they'd compute all of the targets, you know, and they called it out to the guns, and then that we'd call for fire on a certain target from coordinates on a map. And of course we had to, a lot of it we guessed at, but most of the time it's pretty accurate. This fire direction center, they had I think they had about 6 men on each gun, and they'd have to load the artillery shell in there, and then they'd have to put powder behind that to explode to push it on out. So it's quite a job, you know. We had 4 howitzers in ours, so there's probably about 25, 26 men operating them. And then they had about 6 people in fire direction center. And fire direction center there might be just under a tree or something, you know, sitting there with a telephone, and they used slide rules back in them days. They didn't have computers. So they used a slide rule to compute their distance and all that, you know. They did it pretty fast, you know. They were pretty good at it. So it was and when I left hospital in England, I went back to France. You know, as I say, I went back over there and worked in whatever place they need me, so till the war's over.
What was the most important thing you learned, or the most important lesson you took back with you from your war experience?
What was the most what now?
The most important thing that you learned, or the lesson, just something you took back with you from your experience in the military and war?
Well, I learned a lot of them. One of them, I guess, is just the biggest thing I learned is when we get back home, we'll always ought to be prepared for war. Back in World War II, we wasn't very well prepared for war, you know. And we had, in fact, we had to train on. We didn't have enough rifles for everybody to train on back when they first started. And we had wooden guns. They had to, you know, learn how to do manual of arms and all that. So biggest lesson I learned, I just, you know, we ought to keep a good military and ready, I guess. And the next thing, I guess, another thing is how much your family meant to you. I guess that was one of the most important things I learned, that you missed your family. You know, staying over, of course, a lot of us are a lot longer than I was, but I served 2 years, and that's a long time being not seen none of your family, see. And it's, of course, it couldn't be helped because we just didn't have the transportation they have today. About everything was sent over to us on a boat, and it took 10 days, you know, to get from the United States to the shore. Then they had they established there at Cherbourg, they established a truck line, Army. They called it the Cannonball Express. That's what they named it, you know, because they're taking gas, ammunition, they'd pick it up off the boat. And then as they fought in, you know, the time they got in Germany, that line was, what, just 300 or 400 miles. They had to haul that thing. And it was a job to keep supplies from, I think most of it come into Le Havre or Cherbourg or Brest or somewhere like that, and they had to pick all that up. And them guys drove them trucks day and night, you know, and they after they got away over in Germany, they got hijacked, and you know, they had a lot of good food on there, and them people was needing something, so they'd hijack them. Like back in the old Western days, I guess. I don't know, but it was quite a deal. That was quite an accomplishment. Them the Army did was to have that truck line and had it organized like they did to do that. Otherwise, they just couldn't have kept ammunition and food to all the guys, you know. There's so many of them over there that big front. Of course, there's a fighting and over in the Japanese over there. It's a worldwide deal. It's pretty tough. But my job was mostly to try to keep communications to the port observers where we get communications back to our guns so we get targets fired on and all that, you know. It was quite a chore to do that. We'd I had a Jeep, and we had I think there's and the telephone wire, we'd have to lay that, you know, as we went up through. Sometimes it's 7 miles. We had to lay wire from our guns to the Fort Observer Post. Sometimes it's 7 miles, and I'd have to take enough wire, and of course you tie it off. You drive 10 miles an hour, you know, and let that thing roll, and that wire would fall off behind you. So when you got the end of that, you had to put on another and splice it and keep going. So, of course, we didn't have to worry about picking it up. But them artillery shells would break the line, and then we'd have to go back and try to find the break, you know. And it's kind of a chore. But if we was going to be moving all the time, we didn't lay the wire. It's when we knew we was going to be in one position, maybe 3 or 4 days, we would lay the wire. But otherwise, we'd use radios, you know. We didn't use wire. Don't sound like a big job, but it was a big job to keep that wire going. course, we worked before the invasion. We had to waterproof all of our vehicles and our guns. For when you we had to drive them off in the water, you know, when to get on the beach. So you couldn't. You had to, like your spark plugs on your Jeep or something. You had to waterproof that where the water wouldn't stop them, and you exhaust. You had a pipe run up where it is out of the water, you know. And so when you drove off of that ship, well, then you right in the water. So it was a lot of work getting ready for it over on the marshland area, you know.
How many men did you work really closely with?
Well, there's about, in our battery, there was usually around 200 of us in one battery. And they were the ones that we would work together all the time with, you know. And of course, in a battalion, there was 4 batteries, so there was 3 line batteries and a service battery. The service battery was long to do the mechanic work and keep everything going, you know. And then the other 3 batteries, a total of 12 guns. Well, there's about 200. I guess there's about 800 men in the battalion, something like that. But the ones I was closest to was the 200 I was with. But we had trained together for 18 months in the States. Most of us been together that long.
Do you keep in contact with anyone today, or had you in the past?
No, our division, after the war, the Korean War started, and they sent the 2nd Division from Germany to Korea. So the guys that stayed with the division didn't come home. That's where they went. And I never did hear from any of them. Of course, I wasn't with them when the war was over. I'd already got, you know, out of it. So I never did know what happened. And they're still over there. My division's still over in Korea. Or this General Franks, you know, was running the war for President Bush, you know. He retired after the war kind of ended there in Iraq, but I think he was with my division over in Korea. Somebody told me, so I guess he was. And the artillery, 2nd Division Artillery. So, I never did hear we just never, you know, like a lot of the National Guard divisions, they were made up of kind of home folks, you know, I guess. So they more or less had organizations after the war was over to kind of keep in contact with the division I was with. They wasn't a National Guard outfit, so they just didn't have that. I'd sure liked to have seen a lot of them, but I never did see any of them. There was one guy that was in my division, but he happened to be from down where I was raised from, and I saw him. The only one I guess I ever saw it.
Is there any other questions?
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I was in I had 3 campaigns, Normandy, northern France, and the Rhineland as the 3 campaigns I was in. Of course, Normandy was initial assault. And I gave that all to you anyway.
Yeah.
I know I'm no big hero, but I at least were there. Most of us wasn't. We just there try to get the war done. But I was proud to serve. So
Well, thank you very much.
well, you're welcome. Thank you all.